Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
Amanda was sitting in the kitchen, absently fingering the keys on her phone screen. She had been out of work for 2 weeks now. The decision to resign from her previous position was not easy, but the toxic atmosphere and endless conflicts with her boss squeezed all the strength out of her. Her husband, Daniel, watched this process from the sidelines, realizing that she needed time to recover. He didn't push, although he was internally worried about how long her search would take. That evening, everything changed. Amanda, usually quiet and lost in thought, suddenly entered the living room with an energy that Daniel had not seen in her for a long time. Her steps were fast, and her face was lit up with a smile. "I found a new job," she announced with such enthusiasm that Daniel, who was reading the book, put it aside. "Really? How did you do that?" He was surprised. "You haven't even visited the job sites." "It's all Matthew," Amanda said with a satisfied look, sitting down on the arm of the sofa. "We haven't talked for a long time, but he saw my Instagram story where I complained about how hard it was to find a job. His company is looking for someone to replace an employee who is going on maternity leave. He said he thought of me right away." "Well, it's unexpected," Daniel replied thoughtfully, crossing his arms over his chest. "And now what? Do you have an interview yet?" Amanda shook her head and leaned closer to him, adding almost in a whisper, "I'm meeting with him tomorrow. It will be more of an informal dinner to discuss the details." "Dinner?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "It's a little unusual. It's just a meeting," she replied with a smile. "He said he wanted me to feel comfortable before I made a decision." Daniel was silent for a while, thinking. Amanda was clearly enthusiastic, but he himself was skeptical about such coincidences. However, now was not the time to doubt. Her good mood was not worth spoiling. "Okay," he said, exhaling. "But since this is not just an ordinary meeting, let's choose a place that will make an impression. If you want to look professional, the place should also be appropriate." Amanda smiled broadly, clearly delighted at his support. "You know the best places, Dan. Choose something suitable." After this conversation, Daniel looked through the list of restaurants for a long time. They rarely chose something chic for ordinary dinners, but he remembered one elegant place in the city center. It was cozy, with dim lights and a well-chosen interior. This place was perfect for showing professionalism and seriousness. "I booked a table at the Magnolia. You'll like it there," he informed Amanda over dinner. Her eyes lit up. "It's perfect, Dan. Thank you." The next day, Amanda spent the whole day preparing. She went through the wardrobe, trying on one dress after another, asking Daniel for his opinion. Although his comments amounted to encouraging, "You look amazing as always." Finally, she settled on a dark green dress that emphasized her figure, but remained restrained. "It's perfect," she said, spinning in front of the mirror. "Are you sure the restaurant is enough?" "Impressive?" "Amanda, trust me," Daniel said, leaning against the door frame. "Anyone who refuses such an employee after dinner in this place is simply insane." They arrived at the Magnolia on time. Amanda looked flawless. Her confidence seemed to increase with every step. Daniel, despite his misgivings, was genuinely proud of her. "I'll wait for you in the car," he said when they reached the restaurant door. "No, come in with me," she said, suddenly taking his hand. "I want you to support me." Daniel was surprised, but he didn't argue. They entered the hall, where the subdued lights and soft piano melodies created an atmosphere of sophistication. Her friend Matthew was already waiting for them at a corner table. He stood up as they approached and shook Daniel's hand with a smile, and then hugged Amanda warmly. "Nice to meet you, Daniel," he said. "Amanda has talked a lot about you." "Nothing bad, I hope," Daniel replied with a smile. They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed easily. Matthew turned out to be friendly and confident, but Daniel couldn't help but notice how he was looking at Amanda a little longer than usual. It wasn't rude, but still he caught it. When the conversation turned to work, Matthew said that their company focuses on creating creative content for major brands. "I'm sure Amanda would be perfect," he said, emphasizing her talent for design. Daniel didn't say anything, just watching Amanda keep up the conversation with ease. She was clearly in her element. Her energy seemed infectious. At one point, Matthew mentioned that the company's boss, Richard, might want to meet Amanda in person. It was a small detail, but Daniel was hooked on it. Richard usually likes to meet new employees in person, Matthew explained. But don't worry, it's more a formality. Amanda smiled, nodding, but Daniel felt a slight unease rise inside him. He didn't say anything, not wanting to spoil the moment. When dinner came to an end, Matthew paid, despite Daniel's protests. They said goodbye at the exit, and Amanda enthusiastically hugged her friend, thanking him for the opportunity. On the way home, Amanda was excited and talked incessantly, describing how she was looking forward to a new stage in her life. Daniel nodded, smiled, and supported her, but deep down he knew that it wasn't that simple. The next day, Amanda and Daniel sat down at one of the cozy tables of the Magnolia restaurant and waited to meet Richard. A minute later, the restaurant door opened and a man with a perfectly fitting suit walked in. His gait was confident, his gaze sharp. It was Richard, the boss of the company where Matthew had found a job for her. Matthew followed him, trying to keep up, but his footsteps carried much less confidence. Richard noticed their table and, smiling, walked straight towards them. Amanda stood up to greet him, while Daniel remained seated, watching intently. "Amanda, nice to meet you," Richard said, shaking her hand. His gaze, however, lingered a little longer than necessary, studying her from head to toe. "You look amazing." "Thank you," Amanda replied, her voice sounding warm, but she was clearly trying not to blush. "This is Daniel, my husband," she said. Richard turned to Daniel, as if he had just noticed his presence. "Daniel, nice to meet you," he said with a slight smile, holding out his hand. His grip was firm, almost demonstrative. "Thank you for keeping us company." "Likewise," Daniel replied shortly, watching Richard's every move. When everyone sat down, the waiter immediately came over to take their order. Richard confidently took the initiative, ordering a bottle of expensive wine and not waiting for the opinion of others. Daniel didn't like it anymore, but he didn't say anything. His task now was to observe. The conversation started easily. Richard talked about the company, its projects, and how important it is to find the right person to replace. Matthew added comments from time to time, but mostly stayed in the shadows. Amanda listened attentively, sometimes nodding, sometimes asking questions. She clearly wanted to make a good impression. However, Daniel couldn't help but notice how Richard gradually turned his full attention to Amanda. He asked her questions about her past work, her hobbies, her vision of herself in the company. And although his words sounded professional, his tone was too friendly. "Amanda, you have amazing charisma," he said at one point, raising his glass. "It is people like you who make our company better." Daniel raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. He stole a glance at Amanda. She was smiling, but her hands were fidgeting with the napkin a little nervously. "Thank you," she replied, trying to look casual. "I appreciate your assessment." "It's not an assessment, it's a fact," Richard added, glancing at her shoulders. "You are definitely suitable for us." Daniel felt something tighten inside him. He wanted to interrupt this exchange of pleasantries, but decided to give Amanda a chance to handle it herself. However, he was watching Richard's every move and every word carefully. When the waiter brought the main course, Richard continued his offensive. "We have a lot of opportunities for growth in the company. We are looking for not just performers, but those who can represent us at a high level." "Amanda, I think you're just like that." Matthew coughed, as if to remind him of his presence. "Richard, I think Amanda is just getting to know our tasks," he interjected, trying to soften the atmosphere. "Of course," Richard agreed easily, but then added, "But sometimes you see a person and you realize that this is exactly what you need." Daniel intervened for the first time at that moment. "It's really important to see the potential," he said, looking directly at Richard. "But it's probably better to give a person time to show himself in practice, rather than draw conclusions based on dinner." Richard looked at him with slightly narrowed eyes, but then smiled. "Absolutely right, Daniel. We always give people a chance to prove themselves. It's just that sometimes intuition tells you the right direction." After that, the atmosphere at the table changed. The conversation became less tense, but Daniel continued to feel slightly uncomfortable. When dinner was over, Richard suddenly turned to Amanda. "I want you to meet with the rest of the team. This is important for understanding our work. How about coming to our office on Monday?" Amanda nodded enthusiastically. When dinner was over and they went outside, Richard paused to shake Amanda's hand and thank her again for her time. "We will definitely get in touch with you," he said with the same searching look. "See you later." Daniel, standing slightly to the side, crossed his arms over his chest, watching Richard leave. When they were alone, he turned to Amanda. "Are you sure you want to work for him?" he asked. Amanda looked at him in surprise. "And why not? It's just a job," she said, her voice firm, but her gaze wavered a little. Daniel didn't say anything, but he was worried inside. In the first weeks of her new job, Amanda was absorbed in all possible things, as if her life had begun to revolve around this company. Her previous job, which seemed hard and desperately in need of change, faded into the background. With each new day in Richard's company, Amanda felt more confident in the team, received recognition for her ideas and initiatives. But most importantly, she quickly attracted Richard's own attention. He began to personally accompany her on business trips. And although Amanda always said that she was not one of those who needed increased attention, with each new journey her relationship with Richard became more meaningful. On the day they were about to fly to Chicago, Daniel felt the first slight jolt of suspicion. In the morning, when he came to the kitchen, Amanda was already preparing breakfast. Her face was unusually tense. She tried not to look into his eyes. She talked haltingly about the upcoming trip, as if trying her best to get away from the details. "Are you worried?" "What is it?" he asked, coming closer, but her gaze quickly slid away. "No, not at all." She squared her shoulders and gave him her most charming smile. "There will be a lot of work in Chicago, but I don't think it will be difficult." He nodded, but his sense of unease did not leave him. In recent weeks, Amanda has been spending less time on household chores. She seemed absorbed in her work, talking to him only on business. Less and less often she asked how his day had gone, or offered to spend the evening together. When Amanda left, Daniel felt a growing sense of uncertainty inside him. He didn't know what exactly he didn't like: her strange excuses or these business trips in which she completely disappeared from his life. At such moments, when she was leaving, it seemed to him that she was becoming someone else, and he was just a bystander. Daniel tried to talk to her the night before she left, but Amanda took the conversation aside again. "Daniel, it's going to be okay. I'll be in touch. I promise," she said, hurriedly closing her suitcase. "Don't worry about it." But as soon as she left, the tension became even more palpable. The first week of her absence was full of short messages and phone conversations, but she wasn't the same as before. Amanda talked about work, discussed projects, but as soon as Daniel started asking questions, she always found an excuse to quickly change the subject. He couldn't help but notice that her answers were becoming increasingly dry and emotionless, that her presence in the house had become ghostly despite her physical absence. It gave him a strange feeling of loneliness, and with each new call or message, he felt their ties weaken. At this time, his suspicions were growing, especially after he received some strange information from Matthew. It didn't seem to be anything direct, but the conversation left a lot of unclear questions in Daniel's head. "Have you noticed how Richard treats her?" Matthew suddenly asked when they met for a cup of coffee. Daniel frowned, not understanding what he meant. "What do you mean?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep calm. "Well, Matthew looked around several times, as if to make sure they weren't being heard, and then continued, "Richard doesn't hide the fact that he likes Amanda at all. I heard a couple of conversations when they were on a trip to New York. She got into an important position very quickly, didn't she?" Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know what to think about it. On one level of his mind, he didn't want to believe that Matthew was telling the truth, but at the same time, something inside told him that his suspicions were not unfounded. When Amanda returned from her next trip, her behavior was even more aloof. She returned late, and despite the fact that he was waiting for her, she did not look happy to see him. She quickly refreshed herself, but with every look and gesture she made, Daniel felt the distance between them growing. "How was the trip? What is it?" he asked, sitting at the table and noticing that she avoided looking into his eyes. Amanda smiled, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay," she replied, dropping her bag onto a chair. "Richard, by the way, was surprised how quickly I got used to everything." It was weird again. Why was Richard surprised? Why was it important for her to say that? There was something in her voice that didn't have the lightness that usually accompanied her travel stories. "That's good," Daniel said, trying to remain neutral. But his voice faltered. "And you're not tired?" She shrugged her shoulders. "Tired, of course. But it's okay. I'm already used to it. You know how it is in our field. Business projects, permanent business trips." But something didn't add up. Daniel felt that Amanda's answers were becoming more and more streamlined. Her previous frankness and sincerity disappeared in her embarrassment and desire to avoid direct answers. When she left the next time to spend another working week on another business trip, Daniel didn't know how to react. His mind was filled with doubts, and his heart with anxiety. More and more, he began to feel that this was not just a job. Something's going on, something that remained hidden to him. The house was empty and quiet when Daniel returned from work. Amanda was away on another business trip, and it left a strange feeling of emptiness that he couldn't overcome. Putting his briefcase on a chair, Daniel walked into the living room and glanced at the coffee table. Her laptop was there, left in a hurry. Amanda rarely left her appliances at home. She loved to control everything and always kept her devices with her. But now the laptop was here, and it seemed strange. He thought for a moment, then took it and sat down on the sofa. "I'll just take a look," he thought. It seemed to him that it was justified to find confirmation of her honesty or to dispel his worries. However, when he opened his laptop, he immediately came across a strange chat in the messenger, which was automatically connected. The name of the group was slightly alarming. Team D. The messages seemed to flow in an endless stream. He quickly began scrolling up, reading snatches of phrases, until his gaze caught on one message from Eric. "The red dress is just killer. If I had the chance, I wouldn't miss it." Daniel frowned. He remembered the same red dress that Amanda had worn on one of the trips, and his heart began to pound wildly. He continued to read. Tom added, "That's for sure. She always looks like she's doing her best for the bosses." But the most unpleasant message belonged to Richard. "She has a talent for being the center of attention, especially in such things. Of course, with such eyes and a figure." These words cut Daniel to the depths of his soul. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to keep reading. The more he delved into the chat, the more dirty and inappropriate the tone of the discussions became. He realized that his wife was not just the object of Richard's attention, but also the object of ridicule and even desire from other colleagues. Shaking with anger, he started flipping through the messages again until he came across the link that Richard had sent. It was accompanied by a brief comment. "Here is a full review of the trip. Thanks for your contribution, guys." Daniel couldn't believe his eyes. He clicked on the link, and a cloud storage with a lot of videos opened in front of him. At first he hesitated, but then he clicked on the first one. The screen lit up, and Daniel saw a familiar picture, a conference room where employees were gathered. The camera was pointed at the center of the room, where Amanda was sitting with Richard next to her. At first, the video looked innocent. Working discussions, presentations, laughter. But the further it went, the more unpleasant the content became. In one of the fragments, Richard leaned over to Amanda, whispered something in her ear, and then seemed to deliberately linger his gaze on her cleavage. At first, everything was peaceful, but when everyone left, Amanda was sitting next to Richard. Their faces were close to each other. Daniel felt a strange tension, as if he was there, but remained invisible. His gaze couldn't tear itself away from what was happening. Richard was talking in her ear, his lips too close for it to be a business conversation. Amanda didn't move away. She was smiling, tilting her head slightly in his direction, and the movement was both innocent and frightening. Next, Amanda was already sitting on the edge of the table, her legs dangling down, and Richard was standing in front of her. His hands were on the table on either side of her, as if he was trying to corner her. She was laughing, but it sounded strange, unnatural. It was as if she didn't believe in what was happening. Richard leaned closer, and Daniel saw his hand slide to her hip. Amanda didn't pull away. She looked at him, her eyes full of something new. Daniel muttered, looking at the laptop screen. Suddenly, everything was silent. The camera seemed to zoom in, picking out the smallest details. The movement of her hand, the slight tilt of her head, her gaze full of either fear or desire. Richard was whispering to her. but the words were unintelligible. Then she suddenly leaned towards him. Their faces were so close that there was no space between them. Daniel tried to turn away, but he couldn't. His heart was beating like a hammer in his chest. And when it seemed that things had gone too far, Daniel closed the laptop with such fury that he almost smashed it. When he finished, his hands were shaking. Everything he saw seemed both shocking and too real. These videos were direct evidence that Richard was abusing his power. But the worst part was that Amanda didn't try to stop his actions. She may not have encouraged them directly, but her silence spoke for itself. Daniel got up from the couch, feeling a wave of anger and despair wash over him. Everything became clear. It wasn't just a professional interest. Amanda let it go too far. Now Daniel understood that he needed to act, but the question was how exactly. He couldn't let this situation ruin everything without consequences. Gathering his courage, he decided that first he needed to talk to her friend, Matthew, who had once helped her get this job. That was his only clue that could shed light on what was really going on behind the closed doors of the company. Daniel dialed Matthew's number and waited for him to answer. "Hey, Matthew," he began, trying to keep his voice calm, even though he was shaking inside. "We need to meet. I have a few questions about the company where Amanda works." "Of course," Matthew replied, a little surprised. "Are you okay?" "So far, yes. I just want to clarify something. Will we meet tomorrow night?" "Okay, agreed," Matthew agreed. Daniel felt a little relieved when he hung up the phone. This was the first step towards finding out the whole truth. He couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Thoughts of what Amanda was hiding and what he had seen on the video haunted him. But he was determined. He would not let this situation ruin his life without him fighting for the truth. The next evening, Daniel was sitting at a table in a small bar, waiting for Matthew. He came to the meeting earlier to calm down and think about how best to start a conversation. The tension wouldn't let go of him, but he knew this conversation was necessary. Matthew appeared a few minutes later, holding a jacket in his hands and clearly trying to hide his embarrassment. He smiled, but his gaze betrayed a slight wariness. "Hi, Dan," he said, sitting down across from me. "You sounded tense on the phone. Everything is fine?" Daniel took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "Matthew, I need to be honest with you. I found something about Amanda's work, and I need answers," he began, trying not to sound accusatory. Matthew tensed, but tried to keep his expression neutral. "Answers? What are you talking about? What is it?" he asked, taking a sip of water. "About Richard," Daniel said, looking straight into his eyes. "And about how he treats my wife. I've seen the correspondence, and I saw the video." These words acted like a blow. Matthew leaned back, his face pale. "Video? What is it?" he asked, clearly trying to gain time. "What kind of videos?" "Don't pretend, Matthew," Daniel said firmly. "You knew what was going on. I'm sure you knew that. You offered her the job." Matthew looked around nervously, as if afraid they might be overheard. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Look, Dan, I really didn't want to drag her into this. When I offered her the job, I thought it was a good opportunity. But then I noticed how Richard started paying too much attention to her. I tried to warn her, but she wouldn't listen to me." Daniel clenched his fists under the table. "Did you know and did nothing? Did you let her go on these trips with him, knowing that he was acting like this?" His voice cracked with anger. Matthew shook his head, spreading his hands. "What could I do? I'm not her husband, Dan. She made her own decisions. I was just trying to stay away, so I wouldn't get in trouble. Richard, he's a dangerous man. He knows how to protect himself, and no one in the company wants to mess with him." Daniel felt anger boiling up inside him. He tried to restrain himself, but every word Matthew said only increased his rage. "So, you were just looking at it? What is it?" he asked, not hiding his sarcasm. Even when he realized that she had become his target, Matthew lowered his eyes and answered quietly. "I tried to tell you, but I couldn't. None of us can. Richard has everything under control." Daniel thought about it. This conversation made it clear to him that something dirty was really going on inside the company. But now he understood that it was useless to rely on others. If he wants to protect Amanda and himself, he needs to act on his own. "I need more information," he said, trying to sound calm. "You have to tell me everything you know, all the details. If I have proof, I can do something." Matthew hesitated for a moment, but when he saw the determination in Daniel's eyes, he gave up. Good. I will tell. But if you're going to use it, don't involve me. He leaned closer, continuing in a whisper. Richard uses these trips to get closer to the staff. He has a reputation. He starts with compliments, then moves on to more personal conversations. And then he invites you to private meetings under the pretext of work. And it always ends up the same way. Daniel clenched his fists. How long has this been going on? Years, Matthew sighed. Some women quit. Others prefer to remain silent. But Amanda, she caught his attention from day one. He often mentions her. And those videos you've seen are probably just the tip of the iceberg. Does he have any more notes? Daniel could feel the tension building inside him. Matthew nodded. He keeps them in his cloud storage. Only he and a couple of trusted people have access. Sometimes he even shares fragments to, show off. This information made Daniel think. Now he knew where to look. If he can get access to these files, he can expose Richard and protect his wife. Thanks for being honest, Matthew, he said, getting up from the table. You did the right thing by telling me. Matthew looked confused but didn't say anything. He just nodded, watching Daniel leave. Daniel walked home, thinking about his next strategy. Now he had a goal. He had to find these records, gather evidence, and put an end to what was happening in the company. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands clutching the phone so that his fingers turned white. He hesitated for a long time before deciding to take this step. He found the number of Richard's wife, Karen, on Amanda's phone under the pretext of talking about a surprise for the boss. This was his trump card now. His plan was risky, but if it worked, the truth about Richard would no longer remain hidden. Daniel took a deep breath before dialing the number. The phone rang, and a few seconds later a female voice answered. Hello? This is Karen. Hello, Karen. My name is Daniel. I am the husband of Amanda, one of your husband's employees. I'm sorry for the suddenness, but we have a serious conversation. This is about Richard, and I think you need to hear it in person. He began, trying to keep his voice level. There was silence on the other end of the line. But then Karen answered, her voice cold and suspicious. What exactly do you want to talk about? I have found evidence that your husband uses his position in the company for manipulation and unacceptable behavior, he said. I understand that this is difficult to hear, but I can provide you with all the information. This applies not only to my wife, but also to other women. Karen was silent for longer than Daniel expected before speaking again. Let's meet up tonight at the cafe on the corner of 6th and Ash. But I warn you, if you try to drag me into lies or some kind of games, you will regret it. I just want to show you the truth, he replied firmly. See you later. The cafe was almost empty when Daniel entered. He chose a table in the corner where he could see the entrance. Karen arrived exactly at the appointed time. Her image was strictly verified. An expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, but fatigue was visible on her face. She walked over to the table and sat down across from Daniel. You have exactly 5 minutes, she said without unnecessary emotion. Daniel took out his phone, opened the folder with the videos, and put it on the table. Watch this, and you will understand why I called you. Karen frowned, picked up the phone, and started watching. Her face remained unreadable as she looked through the first recordings. But in one of them, where Richard allowed himself to openly flirt with Amanda, her expression changed dramatically. She put the phone down on the table, barely hiding her anger. Is that all? What is it? She asked coldly. No, that's just part of it, Daniel replied. There are also correspondence and other videos. They prove that Richard systematically abuses his position. And I'm sure you had your suspicions. Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. I knew he was getting carried away, she admitted, looking down. But I didn't think he was stupid enough to leave evidence. It's not just about his stupidity, Daniel said firmly. It's about how many women he's already used in his games. It's about how he ruins their lives. I want this to stop. Karen was silent, looking at the table. Finally, she looked up and asked, What do you want me to do? You have influence in the company, he replied. You can transfer this evidence to the corporate level, bypass Richard. If this becomes known to the shareholders or the board of directors, he will not just be fired. His reputation will be destroyed. Karen thought about it. Her gaze became cold and focused. All right, she said at last. I'll do it. But don't think that I'm doing this for you or your wife. I'm doing this for myself. He had gone too far. In the days that followed, Karen acted quickly. She handed over all the evidence to the company's board of directors, including not only videos, but also correspondence in the report. A scandal has started in corporate circles. The managers tried to hush up the situation, but the evidence was too clear. At the next general meeting, Richard was summoned to the leadership and immediately fired. His reputation collapsed overnight. Amanda found out about it at the office. When she returned home, her face was red with anger. She entered the living room, slamming the door. Are you serious? She screamed, throwing her bag on the floor. You destroyed my career. I protected you, Daniel replied firmly, standing up to meet her. Don't you see what he was doing? Don't you understand how he used you? You have no idea what kind of job that was for me. She fiercely accused him. You never believed in me. You were just jealous. It's not jealousy, Amanda. It's true. He manipulated you like the others. His voice was harsh, but not loud. And if you can't see it, then you're blinded. She shook her head, her eyes full of tears. You've ruined everything, Daniel. Absolutely everything, she whispered before leaving the room, slamming the bedroom door. He remained standing in the empty living room, staring at the closed door. He knew he had done what he thought was right, but the question remained, at what cost? Her words still rang in his ears like the echoes of gunfire. After a couple of minutes, he took a step towards the bedroom door and knocked softly. Amanda, he began, trying to keep his voice calm. We need to talk. I didn't want it to turn out like this. Go away, Daniel. Her voice sounded from behind the door, muffled and full of fatigue. I have nothing to tell you. He leaned his palm against the door jamb, closed his eyes, and exhaled. Then he resolutely turned the handle and entered. Amanda was sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, but she didn't cry. She looked devastated but still full of anger. You just went too far, she said without looking up. I could have handled it myself. It was my job, my life. You destroyed everything I built. Can you handle it? His voice became firmer, but he tried to control himself. Do you think it was a career? It was a trap, Amanda. He used you. Do you think he saw you as a professional? All he did was put himself above everyone else and dragged others into the mud with him. She looked up sharply, her eyes flashing. Did it ever occur to you that I knew what I was doing? She shouted. That it was my fight and not yours? You've decided for me, Daniel. You thought you knew better. You've decided that you have the right to get into my life and ruin it. Do you really think I did this out of selfishness? He stepped closer, his face tense. I saw you slowly disappearing. You've stopped being yourself, Amanda. I was trying to protect you because I love you. Do you like it? She laughed bitterly. It's not love. This is control. You always want to keep everything under control. My job, my decisions, my life. He shook his head, feeling the anger begin to give way to pain. It wasn't about control. It was about not letting you become one of the people he used. He would have destroyed you, Amanda. Maybe you don't see it now, but one day you will. She got up, walked around him, and stood by the window. She stood there for a few seconds, silently looking out. Then she said softly, You didn't even give me a chance to figure it out for myself. You just decided everything for me. He stared at her back, feeling a gap form between them. And if I hadn't done that? What is it? He asked, his voice soft but broken. Would you leave? Would you say no to his next move? Would you protect yourself, Amanda? She didn't answer right away. Her shoulders slumped, and she whispered softly, I don't know, but it was my choice, not yours. Daniel came closer, but did not touch her. Amanda, I never meant to hurt you, he said. I just wanted you to be safe, so that this person doesn't use you anymore, or anyone else. She turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. But you ruined everything, Dan. My place, my reputation. Now I'm nobody. Everyone will be whispering behind my back. I will never be able to return to this area. He was silent. She was right. His actions, though motivated by a desire to protect her, destroyed everything she had created. He looked down, realizing that perhaps nothing could be fixed. If you want to leave, he said quietly, I'll understand. But I would do it again if I had to, because the most important thing for me was not to lose you. The real you. Amanda was silent for a long time, her breathing gradually steadying. She turned away from him and returned to the bed, sat down, and, looking at the floor, whispered, "I'm tired, Dan. Just leave me alone for today." I wanted to say something, but stopped. He slowly left the room, leaving her alone, and closed the door behind him. This morning started unusually quietly. Daniel got up early, as always, and went down to the kitchen to make coffee. Amanda, usually already busy with her own business, was still upstairs. He didn't pay much attention to it, but when he heard sharp footsteps on the stairs, he realized that something was wrong. She appeared in the doorway, disheveled, red-eyed, her face a mixture of anger and despair. She was holding his jacket in her hands. "Here?" She threw it on the floor. "Take your things and leave." Daniel froze, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. Her voice was harsh, almost shouting. "Amanda, what's going on?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "What's going on?" She stepped closer, her eyes glittering with anger. "Are you still asking? You ruined my life, Daniel. You made a fool of me, and now you're just walking around here like nothing happened? Did I ruin your life?" His voice hardened. "I was trying to protect you, Amanda. You know yourself that Richard." Richard. She interrupted him. "Stop hiding behind it. You wanted to feel like a hero, but all you did was destroy my career, my reputation. No one even wants to talk to me anymore." Daniel put the cup down on the table and turned to face her. "Amanda, let's be honest. You knew what he was doing. You knew it was wrong, but you let him. You can't blame me for stopping it." She came closer, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if she was trying to hold on. "You always decide everything for me, Daniel. Always." She spoke, her voice trembling. "It was my life, my mistakes, but you took everything away from me, even the chance to fix it yourself." He felt a wave of anger rising inside him, but he suppressed it. Taking a deep breath, he replied, "Amanda, are you saying that I should have stood by and watched you being used? Are you serious?" "Yes." "Stop it," she shouted. "It was my body, not yours." She paused, then looked at him, her face frozen. "You have to leave," she said coldly. "I can't look at you anymore. You've done enough." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Are you kicking me out? After everything?" His voice was full of disappointment. Her answer was quiet but decisive. "I can't live with a man who ruined everything I had anymore." He didn't say anything. There was no regret in her eyes. He turned around, picked up his jacket from the floor, and headed for the stairs. Going upstairs, he packed his things in a small suitcase. Everything he took fit into one bag. He looked at the bedroom where they shared moments of joy and intimacy and realized that there was nothing left of it. When he came down, Amanda was standing by the door with her arms crossed over her chest. She silently watched him approach. Daniel stopped in front of her, not knowing what to say. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. She didn't say anything, just looked away. He opened the door, stepped through the threshold, and felt the cold morning air hit his face. The door slammed behind him. He was standing in the driveway, looking at the house they once shared. But now he was a stranger, just like her. Daniel picked up his suitcase and walked forward. It was an end he didn't want, but which was inevitable. 3 months have passed. Daniel found a job at a local IT company, where he was appreciated for his professionalism and experience. He quickly got into the rhythm of a new life. Morning runs, a busy schedule at work, and evenings spent reading or watching old movies. It wasn't the life he was used to, but it was calm, measured. He liked it. One evening, he was sitting in a cafe near the office, reading a book, when he felt someone gently touch his shoulder. He turned around and froze. Amanda was standing in front of him. Her appearance was both unexpected and familiar. She looked a little different. Her hair was shorter, her clothes were less bright than before, but her eyes were still searching for his gaze. "Hi, Dan," she said softly. He closed the book for a moment, but did not invite her to sit down. "Hi, Amanda. What are you doing here?" She looked away, as if gathering her courage before answering. "I was looking for you. I needed time to think about it. I made a lot of mistakes. I wanted to apologize." Daniel leaned against the back of the chair. His face remained calm, but inside he felt emotions flare up in him. He had been waiting for these words, but he wasn't sure if they mattered now. Apologies accepted, he replied shortly. But why look for me? Amanda looked down at her hands clasped in front of her. Because I still love you, she said, her voice trembling. I realized that I had lost not only my husband, but also my friend. I want to fix everything, to bring us back. Those words pierced him like a knife. He took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. Amanda, he said, looking her straight in the eye. Do you want to come back because you miss what we had, or because you have nowhere else to go? Her face turned pale, as if he had hit her. It's not like that, she said. I realized that I was unfair to you. You've always protected me, and I just didn't want to see it. I didn't know how to deal with what had happened. Do you know now? His voice was cold. Because, to be honest, I don't think you realize what you've ruined. Amanda tried to reach out, but he pulled away. I've changed, Dan, she insisted. I'm not who I used to be anymore. You were right about a lot of things. I was just too stubborn to admit it. He was silent for a long time, studying her face, her eyes that begged him to give her a chance. But something inside him remained motionless. All the pain he went through, all the anger and frustration, it all stayed with him. And although he no longer felt that sharp pain, he understood that there was no way back. Amanda, I'm glad you've realized your mistakes, he finally said. But I can't go back. It would be unfair for both of us. You broke us, and I can't pick up the pieces again. She shook her head, her voice becoming choked. We can start over, Dan. I'm ready to fight for us. He stood up, putting the book back in his backpack. I don't want to fight anymore, Amanda, he said softly. I found peace, and this world is without you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop him. He nodded goodbye to her and left the cafe, feeling a breath of fresh air fill his lungs. He walked home along the deserted street, realizing that for the first time in a long time, he was really free. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.